Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for coming to the New Orleans Jazz Museum. My name is Bailey Badaway. I work here at the Jazz Museum, and today we have a fabulous panel on Storyville. I also want to give everyone a reminder, we have our annual Improvisations Gala on December 6th here at the New Orleans Jazz Museum. Our theme this year is Storyville. We also have a fabulous exhibit on Storyville that just opened on the second floor. So we're all about Storyville right now. Today's panel features Sally Asher, John McCusker, Klaus Sadier, and Eric Seaforth, and I'll pass it over to Sally.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Okay, so really quick. Oh, I'm not loud enough? Thank you. Was that you, Danny, who yelled at me? Thanks, Danny. Okay, so really quick, let me introduce our panelist, John McCusker, who's over here in the end. He has been a photojournalist in New Orleans since 1983, working at the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate. John was part of the team awarded the 2006 Pulitzer Prize for public service for coverage of Hurricane Katrina. He is the author of Creole Trombone, Kid Ory in the Early Years of Jazz, and the co-author of Giacomo, The Native Roots of Mardi Gras Indians. He is also founded the Cradle of Jazz Tour in 1994, with the goal of protecting and marking structures associated with the birth of jazz in New Orleans. After leaving newspaper work in 2006, he worked as a volunteer for Bank USA, aiding in the recoveries from Hurricane Harvey and Michael. In 2019, John founded the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House, a museum telling the story of the 1811 slave rebellion and the early life of jazz pioneer Kid Ory. Right next to me, we have Klaus Sadier. He is the president and CEO of New Orleans Storyville Museum, a sixth-generation New Orleanian. That's very impressive. Klaus graduated from Brother Martin High School and the University of New Orleans before earning his MBA from Indiana University. He moved to San Francisco in the early 1990s, where he launched a successful business career. He is best known for inventing and commercializing the world's first insulated paper coffee cup, known as the Insular Cup. Is that a sample?
This is a competitor.
Oh! Shame on you. Okay. All right. Though he enjoyed his time in San Francisco, he had left his heart in New Orleans, and he returned to his roots in 2013, making his residence in the French Quarter. Wanting to bring the true story of Storyville to a wider audience, Sadley devoted several years researching the historical narrative. While creating his vision for the Storyville Museum, he visited leading institutions around the world to study innovations in museum design, collected artifacts relevant and related to the city's infamous red light district, and assembled a team of local professionals to bring the museum's vision to life. Located just 2 blocks from the historic Storyville district, the New Orleans Story Museum opened its doors to the public in August 2024 and offered the public a unique, immersive, and educational experience. And we do have some artifacts that we'll be talking about at the end up here. Eric Seaforth, right in the middle here. He is the curator and historian of the Historic New Orleans Collection. He is the project lead on the New Orleans Resistant Initiative to preserve and share stories of the New Orleans Civil Rights Movement and the associated exhibition, The Trail They Blazed. He was also the lead curator of the award-winning exhibition, Storyville, Madams in Music, and Captive State Louisiana and the Making of Mass Incarceration. He earned his BA and MA in American History from Tulane University. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so a really quick basic background. How many of y'all are local? Okay, how many? Okay, so about half. For those who are not in New Orleans, are you aware of Storyville? Yes, no? Okay, all right, this is for you. This is for you and somebody, not to point you out. So a really quick basic background. In the 1800s, prostitution was seen as a necessary evil. Every basic major city in the United States had a red light district. It wasn't a really big deal. Everyone kind of knew where they were. New Orleans was no different during this time period. But around the 1880s to the 1890s, these brothels started popping up in the Garden District, in the really expensive, wealthy uptown areas. So you could one day open up your mansion on St. Charles Avenue, and there's a whorehouse across the street from you. Now, if you're a man and you're married and you have daughters, you have to cover your wife and your daughter's eyes every time they step outside, because women have no self-control and they can easily give into temptation. And if they happen to see these fallen and corrupt women, they might instantly become fallen and corrupt themselves.
If only it were so easy.
Which totally makes sense, right? Also why they can't read novels, because, it gives them ideas. So property values plummet because nobody wants to live next door to a whorehouse. So the problem that they had during this time is like, okay, we need to stabilize the housing market because you can collect more taxes, for brothels and saloons. We need to help prevent the spread of disease, and we need to protect the women, the respectable women. They also believed that if they had some kind of public shame of registration, it would prevent women to entering into prostitution and for men from opening up brothels. So they believed with city council that the only way to control vice was to contain it. So they basically made it illegal everywhere else except for in this about 14-block area right outside the Treme in the French Quarter. And this was an ordinance that was introduced by Sidney Story in 1897, and this ran until 1917, until the federal government shut it down with the start of World War I. So one of the things that we're going to talk about really quick, there's a lot of mythology based around Storyville. People have this kind of romantic images of, women in silk gowns, kind of, my paper hit that head. Women in silk gowns lounging on velvet couches with, jazz museum, jazz music floating through the windows and champagne corks popping. But it was a lot more grittier than that. Storyville kind of existed in this area. There was a lot of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, drug abuse, segregation, racial issues, not to be a downer on all this, but so we're going to talk about some of these myths that exist in Storyville and hopefully debunk them and give you all a better understanding of this really misunderstood area. But really quick before we start, Klaus, I think it's very serendipitous that you started the Storyville Museum because you actually have personal ties to Storyville. Can you tell that story really quick?
Well, got into the research a little bit more, and so my background was my great-great-grandfather, gotta go back, he had a pharmacy at the corner of, at the time it was called Custom House and Royal Street, which ended up being actually the major district in the French Quarter. Custom House, which is Iberville now, around Burgundy, was kind of where the district was. But as a druggist, you get into the research and you realize that a lot of the people would go into the drugstores and pretty much hard drugs were completely legal then. So I feel like there was a connection there. But the bigger connection was that my great-grandfather married his daughter, and basically she died in childbirth in 1896. And my great-grandfather was one of the original trainers at the New Orleans Athletic Club, which is the second oldest athletic club in the country, around 1895. And they called them professors. Also, the trainers were also called professors. Of course, our musicians, our pianists were called professors as well. And when his wife died in childbirth, he actually ran away with a 16-year-old girl, not from Storyville, because Storyville hadn't been established for another couple of years, but actually from that red light district there. And the family never saw him. My grandfather was put into St. Vincent's Orphanage, and it's sort of a funny tie to Storyville, yeah.
Funny ha-ha.
Not funny ha-ha, but an interesting connection.
One then. Yeah. Okay, so we have Scandal on the stage right now. Okay, John. So as we briefly mentioned, there's a lot of general mythology based around the prostitution in Storyville. There's also a lot of mythology based around how jazz was invented in Storyville. We have all these famous musicians you played. Can you touch on the type of bands that did and did not play in Storyville, and what musicians were most in demand during that time?
And I'll parse that by saying what music rather than bands. One of the double-edged swords of discussing music in Storyville is you end up using all of your allotted time dispensing with the very hefty mythology around it as a birthplace of jazz, and you don't get around to actually talking about what was going on there. You've got 20 years, so you've got a moving target, and what was popular in, say, 1897 is going to be different from what was popular by 1917. One of our best witnesses about the music in Storyville was Jelly Roll Morton, and he arrives on the scene in Storyville around 1908. And what Jelly points to is really the place that was most important to who he was as a musician and what was happening, he thought musically at the time, was at a place on Villeray called the Frenchman's. Now, this is a fascinating place. It's a place we've known very little. For all the work that's been done and so much about music and Storyville, this is the place that Jelly Roll really identifies, and this is the place I would really like to know a lot more about. But it's an important point. The main musical feature in Storyville was the piano player in the individual brothels. The band music is going on in the cabarets, which interestingly, a number of them are just on the edge of the district. The Big 25 on South Franklin, which is now Crozat. Pete Lala's club at Iberville and Murray, I believe it is. The Tuxedo Dance Hall. These were the main places for bands. But rather than being a fabulous place for New Orleans bands to play, the fact of the matter is there were more jobs on an average Sunday in Millingburg than there ever were in the Storyville district. So one of the mythologies we have is when it closed, it crushed the music industry here, which is, of course, Balderdash.
Well, what we're saying is that bands did not play in the brothels, correct?
Certainly not. Certainly not. The only example I've ever come across in oral history where somebody said that, it was Bunk Johnson, and he's talking about the black section of the red light district at Morris George Gravier and South Franklin, not South Franklin in the white district. And a lot of people conflated these two, including Louis Armstrong. He thought he was born in Storyville. He had to have it explained to him that he was not.
What a shame. Now, describe how esteemed were these piano players during this time period?
Well, they were
what was
really
expected of them, basically?
Yeah, they were really tops. And here's a really good example. You know, for all the gruff that Jelly Roll Morton takes about his reputation and how he thought he was this and he thought he was that, I encourage you to listen to this recording right here, because here he is talking in great respect and homage about other people. And he's talking about the man who, when he came on the scene, was considered the top entertainer in the district, a guy named Tony Jackson.
Yes, Tony Jackson was no doubt the favorite, as I have before stated. And he was a favorite among all. He had such a beautiful voice and such a marvelous range. His range on a blues tune would be just exactly like a blues singer. On an opera tune would be just exactly as an opera singer. And he was always one of the first with the latest tunes.
All right, that's huge what we just heard. So this is future, jazz legend Jelly Roll Morton talking about the musician that he admired most in the district. What he took from the district and who the best guy was is Tony Jackson. And here in 1908, he's identifying the music styles that are being played. Opera, blues, and Tin Pan Alley. And I think that's very instructive. And that's, I think, is as good a window as we get.
It is. So you talk about the active cabaret scene. So we had right outside Storyville is an area known as the Tango Belt. And this was based on the 1913 tango craze, which was considered very, very scandalous. And there was some kind of symbiotic, sinful relationship between Storyville and Tango Belt. I remember there was one news article saying that there was more sin that happened in Tango Belt in 1 hour than 24 hours in Storyville during that time. Now, Eric, can you elaborate a bit on some of the other entertainment that existed outside of the area of Storyville?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, too, talking about Jelly Roll and Tony Jackson before we go there, is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what's so striking to me about that quote that Jelly Roll has of Tony Jackson is I've never heard him talk about anybody else that way. So to me, it speaks to how important this person, Tony Jackson, was in kind of the hierarchy of musicians in Storyville. So I think he is the guy. And it's important to remember that because so many other people come out of Storyville or come out of New Orleans at this time. And
Jelly Roll, he was not short on ego.
He was
at
not
all.
short. No, he was the best. He was the best.
Yeah.
He was the best, except for Tony Jackson, in his words. So like John said, we're looking at a 20-year period here. If you think to your own experiences here in New Orleans or somewhere else, like the place to go in town, wherever your town is, changes over time to go out, and see some music. Like that is a moving target. So one of the things we see is that there are spaces, just before Storyville opens in the kind of lakeside part of the French Quarter, where there's lots of places to see music. It's kind of seedy. There's prostitution. Then you kind of see Storyville become the place that is one of the premier entertainment districts in the city for about 15 or 20 years in that period, where there are, in addition to the brothels, where you're going to hear, if you are at a brothel, you're going to hear, and speaking of kind of the big fancy establishments, there's not that many of them. We're talking about maybe a half dozen to 10 places, predominantly on the 200 and 300 block of Basin Street. These places have piano players that have to play what the audience wants. So that's why they're playing popular things, which are like opera overtures and ragtime, Tin Pan Alley. And they have these beautiful mirrored ballrooms where they're playing these songs. But outside of that space, there are smaller houses, maybe with one or two sex workers. There are also cribs, which are single rooms where sex workers are working. And then there are also bars, honky-tonks, cabarets, dance halls, restaurants. One of the first places you would have seen as you get off the train, if you arrive as a tourist, and most of the clientele of the district are going to be white male tourists, is Tom Anderson's Cafe, which is restaurant and bar right there. There's also the Terminal Cafe in the 100 block of Basin, another bar right there. So these other spaces are going to have different types of music, less piano players, but you might see a brass band or more likely a dance orchestra. So a dance orchestra, if you think of usually around a 7-piece group, you'll have percussion, a trombone, cornet or trumpet, clarinet, one or two banjos or guitar, and often a violin. And they're going to play dance music, popular of the time. This could be more kind of what we think of as ragtime, Tin Pan Alley songs, probably less opera, but not incorporating all of the jazz elements that we're familiar with today, like syncopation. There will be probably syncopation, but not the musicians necessarily doing the syncopation, but syncopation on the page that's written. You'll probably not see all the blue notes or bending of notes. That stuff does happen in the district, but it's going to happen kind of later at night. It's going to happen in places like the Frenchman, where musicians are participating in what we call cutting contests. They're going up against each other. So like, Tony Jackson, Jelly Roll, these other piano players, they're going to work their shift at the Star Mansion or the Arlington, and then I don't know, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, they're going to go over to Frenchman's and take turns at the piano and try to show who's, number one. And it's at those moments that you're going to see the most experimentation. There are no rules. You're not playing for someone to give you tips anymore. You're playing to show that you are the best. So that's kind of the scene that's going on in that area. And the clubs, just to say some names, like John said, we have Pete Lala's Big 25, the Tuxedo Dance Hall, Abadi's Cabaret, the Entertainers, Frank Early Saloon. And some of these places are on the other side of Canal Street, so part of the Uptown District, which is also where the Funky Butt Hall is located, which is really a community space that Buddy Bolden would play in others, but he's most famous for playing in on weekend nights. And this space also operated as a church on Sunday morning, so which I find really interesting. But so it's a long answer to your question.
Well, just for some clarification really quick, I had read this newspaper article in 1914, 1950 during this time where they stated that there was a hierarchy between the women in Storyville. So you have the prostitutes and you have the bee drinkers, and these are the women who would sit in the bar and kind of slide up to you and touch your arm and encourage you to buy them drinks and buy drinks. And then there was the dance hall girls. And the dance hall girls were considered the lowest of the low, which is ironic because you have these prostitutes of all these different levels. Can you describe what a dance hall is?
I can try, sure. It's a club, right? There's gonna be, like I said, probably a dance orchestra. There's gonna be a bar, and people are gonna be coming to dance. And I think also it's important that we think of the music in Storyville, by and large, is dance music. People in early jazz is dance music. It's for people to dance. It's not, for us to sit down and listen to as we kind of do mostly now, but this was dance music, so that's
It's
what
and they're
these spaces were.
paying the dance hall girls anywhere from like 10 cents to 20 cents per dance. So that's where they were making their money, was from dancing with these strange men that they're pressing up against them, and they're being grabbed and sweaty and drink. So that's what they were considered like the low. So that's how the women were making their money in the dance halls. They were getting paid from these men to actually participate in the dance.
Yeah, because like I said, the clientele in this whole area, this is the target audience for Storyville, for all these places are white men of means. So people with money to spend. You're not going to get I'm sure there were New Orleanians and Louisianians in these spaces. Tom Anderson and his friends, for example, and he as a state legislator. But largely you're getting people out of town. It's right, Basin Street is on the train tracks. So like people are coming in from out of town, especially over the winter tourist season in New Orleans. Think about right around Mardi Gras. And so that's who they are, and we'll talk more about the Blue Books, but that's who they're, trying to get in the door. And, entertainment district, it's not necessarily a space that you might go out with as a young couple to go dancing.
I wanted to make sure that was clear.
Yeah, I should have clarified.
You're not bringing your date there.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, or your mother. Okay.
Yeah, one other kind of funny observation in music in the district. It was Philip Werlein, whose music store was the gold standard in New Orleans for 150 years, who proposed that they put the wall between the station and Storyville so people didn't see it when they arrived
Respectable
into the city.
people didn't see it.
Yeah, his store's on Canal Street, and he's selling sheet music during the day. We know from the oral histories to a lot of the sex workers in Storyville who are bringing it back to give to professors to play or to practice themselves, because a lot of them were also performers, entertainers, musicians.
And
So
Kid Ory bought his trombone there, too.
That's an interesting note. Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of entertainment, Mardi Gras is often touted as the greatest free show on earth. But a lot of society people belong to very elite and very expensive crews, and they had these very elaborate and highly exclusive balls. Klaus, can you talk about some of the way that the residents of Storyville celebrated Mardi Gras?
Yeah, so as Sally was saying, back in those days, you had really two main crews. You had Rex and you had Comus, very old line, blue blood, society New Orleans. In fact, today, you can't get into those clubs unless you were born into them. And they keep a lot of the traditions still, actually very secretive. So you had this going on, society New Orleans, and of course you had Storyville. And Storyville had their own way of celebrating, which actually started even before Storyville. And there were two famous balls that they would have, sort of as parodies of the blue-blooded balls. And they were called the CCC ball, and probably the more well-known one was the ball of two well-known gentlemen. And if you were from New Orleans, you knew who these well-known gentlemen were. One was Tom Anderson, as we mentioned before, who was a state legislator, also probably one of the biggest landowners in Storyville. Had his hand in a lot of the brothels, and a restaurateur named Frank
So to
Lamont.
speak.
Yeah. His hand in the pie, as they say.
I like that little innuendo. Okay.
That's the best slips and binders full of women.
So unlike the sort of the blue blood balls where you'd have the tableau and you'd have men in tights, these balls you would actually have prostitutes would be your performers, and so the women were all prostitutes that were invited, but the men, on the other hand, were police chiefs or police officers, politicians, very wealthy businessmen, and of course everybody would go in masks, so you could kind of get away with that. And some of the stories were that on Mardi Gras night, you'd have Rex and Comus balls, and some of the society men, the way those balls are, you actually don't even mix. You actually are separated. The men are on one side, the women on the other, and it's quite a long affair, and it's not that exciting, to be honest with you. So they would sneak out, and they would go to these balls, unbeknownst to their wives or their their girlfriends, and they would spend 2 hours at the ball of two well-known gentlemen having a great time, and then they would sneak back in to the ball as if nothing happened. But so that was what went on. And there's also another interesting story that in 1906, so the balls became quite popular, and it would be something that you'd want to get a ticket to. And so a lot of society girls were wanting to go in costume and actually take a look at these fallen angels for themselves. And they figured they could get away with it because they could sneak in costume. So this had been going on apparently for a number of years, and a lot of the madams and the ladies of the demi-monde were, they didn't like it. They didn't like the society women's coming to gawk at them. So there's a story that in 1906, Josie Arlington, one of the famous madams, arranged, with the knowledge of Tom Anderson, to have a raid on one of the balls. And they would check all the women if they had their prostitute in good standing card. And of course, if they didn't, they would be unmasked, arrested, and brought down to the station, which they did. And the girls had to call their daddies, the real daddies, to come pick them up. So apparently that was the last time that they ever infiltrated the balls.
They used to actually call them slumming tours, which was something that they would do. And I also recently found out during that time it was common for young people to go to the court systems and sit in the night court, basically, to hear the very explicit testimony of these arrests and the women. So they would call them slumming tours, and that was something to do with the slum was becoming fashionable during that time period.
One other observation about perhaps Mardi Gras and the seasonal part of it, just to mention real quick. Kid Ory talks about them, the bands, particularly laying into playing in Storyville during Lent. And the reason was the locals didn't dance, but the visitors did. So since they're playing dance music, the only dancers for that period were predominantly at the district.
And also Mardi Gras Day during the time was the one day a year that respectable women were allowed into bars. So it was kind of like this one day of freedom because everything's topsy-turvy during that time. Okay, so nothing's free, even though Mardi Gras is considered the greatest free show on earth. Nothing's free, especially in Storyville. And Storyville was actually very commercialized, and businessmen published what they called a blue book, which was literally a guidebook to Storyville. Eric, can you talk about how Storyville was ultimately promoted and advertised in these pamphlets?
Yeah, so these are really interesting kind of documents, and we have a few remaining versions. You can see some of them on the screen here that tell us a lot about Storyville, and also not as much as you might think. So these books were published. There's a couple different ones. The Blue Book is one series of them. You can see there's another kind of one-off, the Red Book. Josie Arlington, Lulu White puts out her own about her New Mahogany Hall. And what they include are listings with addresses and names of all of the brothels and all of the sex workers in each brothel, and oftentimes their racial identity, and then advertisements. And every once in a while, you'll also get images, some photographs of interiors of some of the brothels. There you can see one, which is really an interesting peek into these larger establishments, like I said, mostly in the first 200, 300 block of Basin Street. Lavishly decorated, very Victorian, lots of fabric everywhere, and mirrors and chairs. And you can see one of the things that they're selling in these spaces specifically is luxury and exoticism. So you'll have like the Turkish room or the Japanese room. You'll have mirrored ballrooms where you'll see nothing but mirrors and a piano. These books are produced, again, for white male travelers. They are distributed primarily at, off of the railway station, at bars like the Terminal Cafe. I'm sure you could get one at Tom Anderson's. We're pretty sure Tom Anderson pays for the printing of some of them. Billy Struve, it was the printer of the Blue Books, and he was an employee of Tom Anderson. And so these were really just advertising for the district and for the brothels in the district. The different madams might pay to have their photo or a photo of some of the girls or a full page spread included. And they're just really interesting to see. They also include this kind of florid, pretty, flowery, florid is probably not the right word. They're very flowery, unspecific language about what you might find at the different brothels that's repeated year after year for oftentimes different places, you know. You'll have the most fun with the jolly good fellas of Hilma Burt's place, you know, that kind of language over and over again. It never says what that is. It doesn't include prices. It doesn't include kind of anything explicit, you know, in all the meanings of the word. It tells you very little about the place. It does share about some of the cabarets and dance halls and saloons you could go to. So they're really kind of interesting things to look at. They are not unique to New Orleans. We know that these have existed. I think that, you know, the earliest one is like 1500s in Venice is kind of the first guide to prostitution in a city. So they've existed for a long time, but there's a collection of them that exists here from Storyville. So I'm with the Historic New Orleans Collection. We're a museum on Royal Street in the 500 block, and we have a collection of them. Klaus has made some reproductions of one of the Blue Book versions of the Blue Book that you can peek at here. Yeah, and then we put out a book a few years back in 2017 for the centennial of the end of Storyville that y'all are welcome to flip through here, and you can see kind of the different versions of the Blue Books there as well.
Yeah. I think what's interesting too is like the evolution of the Blue Book. You know, like in the earlier editions, like the 1900s, there was actually an ad for VD tonics, you know, Cure VD if you get it, and they also had an ad for a funeral parlor. That was not in the next year. They probably thought this is probably not a very good idea.
The ads are amazing. You see a lot of that. And it's, you know, a lot of the funeral parlors are also acting as like liveries. Like there, you can rent out, you know, horse and carriage or whatever you need. Lots of booze, ads for booze and cigars. And, you know, we didn't talk about this conversation, but one of the, you know, this is an economic hub, right? Like the people are spending money in this space in these 10 blocks, and the thing they spend the most money on, what the madams are making their money on by and large, is alcohol sales. That's what's driving the economy of the area. So yeah, I think you mentioned popping champagne. There's a lot of ads for booze. There are a lot of bars. There are a lot of saloons, and they're selling all of that across that whole area. So you see it in the Blue Books, you see it in the guides, and you hear in the oral histories madams and other people talking about how important it was to sell booze.
If you came in and you bought a $5 bottle of champagne, the madams took care of you. Basically, they took care of you. I recently discovered in The Mascot, which was the largest weekly illustrated newspaper during that time period, October 1897, just a few months, or about, you know, that same year that Storyville came into play, they printed a directory in The Mascot in their newspaper columns, just very simple, like listing the names of the prostitutes and where they were. But when Erica touched on about how they were not most, but a lot of them were segregated, that they would list the race of the prostitutes, they would have W for white, C for colored, O for octoroon, which at that time was considered 1/8 black, which was considered some of the most desirable prostitutes during that time. And you do see some that say J for Jewish, which was also considered very desirable because Jewish prostitutes were considered to be more passionate than some of them, and maybe do things that the other prostitutes would not. So now, basically, we talk about how these were divided by race. We have something that happened in 1913, which was called the Dance Hall Murders, which was a murder happened in one of the dance halls, and it led to the ban of music in Storyville and the Tango Belt. John, can you talk about some of the issues that the musicians faced during this time and the mythology that occurred of the great exodus, you know, to the east after the closing of Storyville?
Yeah, well, let me touch a little bit on the Tuxedo Dance Hall, because that did have a lot of implications. It closed, you know, band music for a time, and, it made everybody sort of look over their shoulder a little bit. What happened is there was some sort of row that was going on between the owners of the 101 Ranch on Iberville and the Tuxedo Dance Hall on South Franklin Street, now Crozat. The Tuxedo Dance Hall was a bar room that you would enter. It was a long, skinny bar room, and then that opened up in the back to the dance floor. And one night in 1913, King Oliver's band is playing there. And shots erupt. There's a murder. There are bullets all over the place. It becomes this big sensational thing. And the district gets tamped down on for a while. Now, coming back to the mythology of Storyville, the first half of the myth is jazz is born in Storyville. The second half of the myth is when Storyville closes, there's no longer work for musicians, and they go up on the romantic riverboats up to Chicago. Well, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you the Mississippi River does not go to Chicago. Similarly, the factual veracity of those previous statements is just as good. The idea was that there was no work. Well, there was a crackdown in the nightlife, but it only began with Storyville. It was the big sore thumb sticking up there. And if you track the rest of the year, everybody's getting stomped. All of the black clubs, particularly, that were at Gravier, South Rampart, they're all shut down by 1919. The Volstead Act hasn't even come down with Prohibition, and they're getting shut down. And even then, there was not an exodus of musicians. So you do have a major tamp down. What gets mistaken for the musician exodus was, in fact, the Great Migration, in which hundreds of thousands of black folks, regardless of jazz and what white folks were doing to get off in New Orleans, decided to go find better lives for themselves in Chicago and Los Angeles. That's why people left. It had nothing to do with the Storyville district or anything else. And if it was going to be because the nightlife was being tamped down, it would have happened in 21 and 22, not 1917.
Okay. That's a good answer for that. Okay, now, so during this time we talked about the clampdown. I also remember reading in the early days of Prohibition that they had Mayor Martin Burham took over. He would be the one exclusively to give you your music permit for your dance hall. So it was like he decided whether you were allowed to play live music or not. And there was the whole ring and the politics involved. And music was so important to the livelihood of these bar owners and these dance halls that Mayor Martin Burham could basically just shut you down by not allowing you to have a music
Well,
permit.
the good thing was Martin Berman loved jazz, and he used to hire Ori's band all the time.
He hated certain business owners. Not Tom Anderson, who was a friend of his. Okay, so we're getting the shutdown. In early 1970, you have the Commissioner of Public Safety, Harold Newman. They were trying to do a massive cleanup campaign, and he decreed that Storyville would be entirely racially segregated, and all women of colored or Negro race working there, regardless of their wealth or their standing, would have to move out to Black Storyville, outside the area, regardless if they owned a house, anything like that. By March 1st, they gave them about 6 weeks. I'd say it was roughly about, it was like mid-January. They gave them like 6 weeks saying you have to leave, you're out, you know.
Yeah.
So this was New Orleans' first ordinance specifically intended to segregate residential areas on the basis of race. Klaus, can you talk about some of how the madams fought back with this ordinance?
Yeah, so this is early 1917. Now, Storyville does close in November the same year because of the war effort. But at this point in time, they don't have that
Hindsight,
hindsight. So yeah, as Sally said, the city actually passes an ordinance which specifically says, it doesn't actually say work, but it says anyone known to be a prostitute that's black is not allowed to live or occupy a residence in the district known as the white Storyville, the main Storyville district. But it also said anyone of the white race is also not allowed to live live in the area known as Uptown Storyville or the black district.
Regardless if they own their houses or not.
It didn't mention the ownership. And so they actually went to enforce it on March 1st, and Lulu White, along with Willie Piazza and about 20 other madams, immediately filed lawsuits in civil district court in New Orleans. and were given a stay. Basically, they were trying to evict them, and while the case was adjudicated, and their argument, Willie Piazza's argument was, the city's argument was, well, look, we have the right to segregate. We have the right to segregate for transportation. We have the right to segregate for schools. And we also have the right to segregate vice. So they were saying it's vice we're trying to segregate, not where you live. But Willie Piazza's argument was the ordinance didn't say anything about work. It just said prostitutes living. It didn't say prostitutes working. It said prostitutes living. So basically, it was held over for a couple of months, and then the city was allowed to proceed. At which time they both appealed. Willie Piazza and Lula White appealed to the Louisiana State Supreme Court. And again, the matter before them was, do you have the right to segregate based on where someone lives? And their argument, and it'd be interesting to see what would happen, their argument was that we own property, and you're trying to basically evict us without due process.
That's a winning argument.
That was the winning argument, and the state Supreme Court immediately decided in favor of the win. It was actually probably one of the biggest and first landmark civil rights cases or segregation cases in history. Doesn't get a lot of attention because Storyville had been closed down a few months later. But basically, it was a landmark case and said, no, you can't legislate where someone lives. The city actually went back to try to change the ordinance to say, forget about where it lives. We want to say where you work. By that time, and that would have been interesting to see what would have happened if they would have legislated that, but they never got a chance to do it because the World War I broke out, and the Navy and the Army put bases here, and basically they had a regulation that said they couldn't have a base within a reasonable distance of a red light district. So it was shut down.
Can I add some context really to that too? Because it's like you said, this is a landmark case. And I just want to, get us outside of Storyville for a second. And if we think to what's going on in New Orleans and across the country related to segregation, 1896 is the year that Plessy v. Ferguson is decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a year before Storyville. And that's the case that arises here in New Orleans that results in the Supreme Court of the United States saying that separate but equal is allowable, is constitutional. And what are we at? Just over 20 years later, we get this case that challenges that ruling. It's one of the first, because Plessy v. Ferguson, we have segregation cases going before the courts always. These are pop up all the time, especially during Reconstruction and between Reconstruction and Jim Crow. But this is the first since that Supreme Court ordinance passed, or Supreme Court ruling, that really pushes back and is a victory for or against segregation. And it's also interesting because Storyville, we talk about how we're talking a little bit about it's, segregated. We have the black Storyville and the white Storyville, but this is really kind of more complex than that because this is one of the few spaces in the entire city where white and black people are mixing together for these 20 years, where Jim Crow is kind of not quite as strong. It's not quite taking hold, and it's largely because of the desire of white out-of-towners to consume local black culture. But you see there are bars and cabarets known as Black and Tans where they have both black and white clientele, and the police are not breaking them up. You see these, the musicians of Storyville. There's about 200 plus musicians we've identified that have played at some point in Storyville. I think there's only one that was known to be a white musician. So you got all these black musicians, you got black sex workers, you got white sex workers, and you got white clientele. So you have this big array of white and black New Orleanians and Americans coming together. And it's, the war is one of the reasons that the place is shut down. But there's also this idea that this is a space and a thing that shouldn't be happening anymore. And it's kind of one of the last places where this can happen in New Orleans. So after Storyville, you really see it's a lot harder, and you see it linger on in some places. Bourbon Street is a good example, especially in the 40s and 50s, where you have black entertainers and you have white out-of-towners coming to consume that culture. But I think part of what's happening here in the 1915, 16s, and 17, those years, is a kind of a pushback against this limited but kind of racial mixing, whatever you want to say. It's limited, but it
Well,
exists.
and it's no coincidence that right after that we have the rise of nephrology, a lot of the bad racial pseudoscience that's coming along, and of course by 1925 the Klan is larger than it's ever been. So you have a real, even though we're in the middle of the Jazz Age, you also have this pendulum swinging the other way in society now.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take some questions. Does anyone have some questions? Any questions? This is your time. You've got all these experts up here. Any
I can't
questions?
believe 4 people
Yes.
talked about sex and stuff like this.
I
and
know.
any
Come on,
questions.
sex and music. Let's get. Yeah.
I'm curious architecturally, what it's all been raised. What kind of buildings?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Oh, they're gorgeous.
So I can talk a little real quick on a couple things. I'll try to be real quick. So on Basin Street, you're going to see large Victorian mansions, 3, sometimes 4 stories, with these kind of turrets going all the way up, and cones on top. And those are mostly built kind of in the late 1890s, like right after Story. We're like, all right, this is going to be the place. People start spending money and building a few. And again, this is like 6 to a dozen maybe buildings. Back of that street, you're going to see buildings that were part of what used to be a working class majority black neighborhood. So this neighborhood we know had manufacturing, it had residential, and it had a very active church as well. So a lot of those residences, the smaller residences, are going to be turned into 1 or 2 or 3 person spaces. And then you're going to get kind of the low-slung cribs, 1-story kind of buildings that have a number of door, window kind of thing. But what I also want to point out is not just kind of what the place looks like, and you can see some of it in postcards of the time and photos, but that, we go from, this is a back-of-town space, which is, we're saying not the French Quarter, not highly visible, typically African-American space. The city is like, this is where we'll put this, this is where we'll put this vice area. The vice area runs its course, kind of, whatever, we talked about all these reasons, it kind of dies out. And then the city's like, you know what, we're just going to raise it, and we're going to build government housing there. And so that area in the late 30s and early 40s is knocked down and becomes the Iberville Housing Project, which is a whites-only housing project and one of the first built in the United States. That space kind of, again, peters out by the, around early 21st century, has transitioned from a segregated all-white housing space to predominantly black housing space, and the city once again decides, you know what, we're just going to knock that down. So in addition to the architecture, what I think is really interesting is the revolving residential pattern and decision by the city and city administrations to say, this space doesn't matter, we'll take it and we'll just knock everything over and build it anew. And you see that over 100 years happen, what I described 3-4 times, I think.
Yeah,
Well, I think it's fascinating. Within 30 years, you have 2 examples of social engineering that failed.
Yeah.
They did have, I remember reading articles about the 1930s, 1940s saying, we don't want to repurpose this. This is sinful. We want to tear this down, basically. And there was a very small kind of satirical grassroots movement to actually call the Iberville housing projects Arlington Acres after Josie Arlington. But then you see in the 1970s, and I always call it like the 50-year regret, that a lot of people were like, maybe we shouldn't have torn these amazing historic buildings down after the fact.
There are 3 remaining structures.
Yeah.
Fortunately, one that Tony Jackson was basically in residence at, which is a little bit off of Basin Street at Iberville. Bienville.
All the sexy ones got torn down, though.
Bienville first,
unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's one further back, which is in terrible shape. And there's one that was Lulu White actually had a saloon next door to her brothel. It used to be 2 stories. It's now 1 story. It's like a convenience store. But so there's literally just 3 structures left.
Yeah, and just in my lifetime, I mean, back to the mid-'90s, there were still 2 other structures that were there that went down, and nobody gave a peep about
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have been, even in the 30s, like you see pictures of Storyville and, Mahogany Hall, which the annex, that we're talking about, which you can see is probably the most visible of any of them. It's right there on Basin at the end of the 200 block, and it looks like a concrete block. It's like orange, I think.
Yeah, Basin Bienville.
Yeah, Basin Bienville. So, but if you look at photos of it of Mahogany Hall in the 30s, it goes from this ornate Victorian building to a rectangular box. Like all the ornament is gone. And all these buildings, all the ornament is gone. And I don't know, I know that a lot of the owners of the larger brothels sell off a lot of their stuff. That happens in the late teens. We see it in the newspaper. It's like, come buy, at auction, all of Lulu White's stuff. She's got all this nice stuff, couches, curtains, chairs, piano, whatever. But like the building ornamentation is gone too. And I find that I don't know what happened.
Well, there are
stuff.
pictures of it that ran in the Picayune right prior to the 49 demolition, and you can see their workers removing wood paneling from the stairway.
Oh, wow.
So there was some of that went on. I know I know the Jazz Museum has the curbstone.
Yeah.
From out Fountain. I believe the late Pete Fountain had the fan window.
So the fan window is now, we have Lulu White's fan window, and we have a panel of Arlington's mirrored ballroom. But yeah, it's interesting to see these buildings kind of lost their luster well before they ended up being turned.
Well, actually, this, for example, Josie Arlington's grandniece, who has been actually loaning our museum a lot of things that were in her family since Arlington closed down. And it's neat because they're in a succession, and some of them actually appear in the pictures in the Blue Book. And these two candlesticks were something that she loaned us last week that we're going to put into the museum, but I thought I'd bring them here. So that gives you an idea what the furnishings would look like. And actually, if you look at the pictures,
You can find them.
This is very, the whole place looked like this, basically.
Yeah, the old Tulane Jazz Archive had the mirrors from Lulu White's. They had a whole settee
really?
from in there,
And
and I don't know
what-
what happened to
what
them
did
since they
you-
closed the Jazz Archive.
What mantle did you just get from Tulane?
Oh, so Tulane, well, they have here in the exhibit, it's the one from
Himmelbert?
Hilma Burt's, which allegedly is the one that Jelly Roll Morton was playing in front of her in the famous
That's
picture
the
where
one.
you just see
Yeah,
the back
yeah,
of the set. They have that here. It's on display in the
Oh,
exhibit.
fabulous.
And you're
good.
loaning this to them,
Yeah,
correct?
so we're loaning
Yeah.
that to them. They have it here.
All right.
And they've
Any-
loaned us the curbstone.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
we have Josie Arlington's curbstone, which is
And how-
1,500 pounds of
I was saying-
granite. That,
It's huge.
yeah.
Yeah.
that we
It's
moved.
the largest Dolly Granger makes to get it over there, probably.
Yes, sir.
Yes, is there any information on singers in Storyville, and if so, the lyrics, is there any information on whether the lyrics were more innuendo or more explicit?
Yeah. Well, of course, when Jelly's speaking, he's talking about Tony being a singer and singing in a great tenor and so forth. So certainly for some entertainments, that's part of it. And the idea of ribald songs is certainly something that got embraced on all different levels in New Orleans music, even at the grassroots level. Sometimes if you got off the train and you were heading to the district, there'd be these kids there with what they called spasm bands. And they would make their own instruments out of guitars, out of cigar boxes, like guitars and so forth. There's the Razzie Dazzly Spasm Band. There they are. And they would sing songs like call and response songs like Little Liza Jane. And the fun part of singing Little Liza Jane is you make it a little grittier every pass of the lyrics. So you might open with I got a girl and you got none, Little Liza Jane, and by the end, you're going, you're singing about.
You can say it, John.
I can say it.
Sure.
Well, I mean, say you swing Sally and or swing Sue. There ain't no difference between the two. And just start, and start, building like that. I got a girl and you got none, and in that way, it's sort of a fun thing. But it's also a good song to greet visitors because there are other versions of call songs like Little Liza Jane and Shoe Fly Don't Bother Me where you can name check people's hometowns. So the first original sheet music of, say, Little Liza Jane was, I got a girl in Baltimore, trolley going by her door. And all the lyrics are name checking places. It's like a bad Huey Lewis song or something. But that is the other end. So if the high end, you've got Tony Jackson singing opera, you've got the Razzie Dazzy Spasm Band and this bunch of little waifs hanging around the periphery of Storyville.
We know too that some of the sex workers would sing. So they would like I was saying, they were getting sheet music at Whirlines, some just to practice, but because they wanted to play. But also they'd say, hey, Tony, Mr. Jackson, Professor, whatever they called him, can you play this? I'm going to sing. And there is, I do think, yes, that they were adding to the lyrics,
Well, and of course, when Pretty Baby, Tony's great composition, gets published nationally, it's not with his lyrics.
Yeah, right.
They've got a nice New
Cleaned
York Jewish boy that's going to write them some very nice lyrics, but his were all singing about jelly roll. You talk about your jelly roll is sweet. It was much more heavy with the innuendo.
And I just want to say, too, mention one other person's name, Anita Gonzalez. She is the only musician mentioned by name in any of the Blue Books, and she also happens to be a madam. And it says she sings, she plays cornet, and I think a few other instruments as well. And there are other women that we know were singing in the district. Ann Cook is one. Mamie Desdunes. Who also played piano up. Wasn't she uptown? Did she play with Jelly Roll?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a handful of women that we know that were singing up in the Uptown district.
She was Jelly's next door neighbor when he lived uptown.
Wow. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask about Reconstruction. How did Reconstruction play out against the scene you're talking about?
Ooh, that's a good
Well,
question.
Judith Schaefer, what am I last name? Judith Schaefer. She wrote what's considered like the first book on what happened during the Civil War of sex workers. It's like, I think it's called Illegal Sex in Antebellum Era. Judith, she was a mentor of mine, and now I'm blanking on her last name. She was one, basically, she had told me she had walked into the downtown library one time, and an archivist said, hey, have you seen these records of these court records of these women, of these prostitutes during this time period, during the Civil War and the antebellum and after? And she was the first one who kind of did the first serious study on sex workers during that time period. Judith Schaefer Keller, I'm blanking on her name. She's really the only one who's really ever written about that. And if you come up to me afterwards, I will write the name. I will find it and I will write the name down for you. I promise. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so we can raise the buildings, but the vice is not going to go away.
Absolutely not.
So where'd they go?
No. Well, a lot of them, I know you said Millenberg went out there.
Chef
That was
Highway.
like absolutely crazy. And a lot of them just never left. Lulu White was repeatedly arrested over and over and over again. And I found a really interesting case about a woman in 1919 where also, you have an underpaid police force, right? We also don't have a very big police force during this time period. And, they're getting a piece of the cut during this time. And so they've lost a lot of their income because during the Tango Belt era, you had to have a police officer stationed outside. So they're making side work, they're shaking down the prostitutes, they're making this money. So when Storyville shut down, there's this important case, I don't know if it's really written about yet, about police officers who are basically blackmailing respectable women, saying, look, unless you give me money, we'll arrest you for prostitution. And your reputation at that time is everything. I mean, it's absolutely everything to you. And so there are even, respectable women who are now living, the rents are much cheaper during this time period. And in Old Storyville, they're getting harassed, by the police for the corruption. So the police basically, they lost a huge part of their income when Storyville was shut down. Of course, it didn't go away. And then Norma Wallace came in at the end, and her house is just, two houses
Right in
down?
the corner, which is Belloc
Which is-
home.
Which
Yeah,
is Ernest Belloc, the Storyville photographer's own
Yeah,
home,
in the corner,
which
so
is
yeah.
right down the museum.
There's two
So she
sections
kind of
still
took
working there.
she kind of took advantage of it.
So funny. It's
When you were
actually pretty
talking about The blue book that you had said that you had found today, what was it? The one that you just discovered, what was it? The
late arrivals.
The late arrivals, that one of the later books said that here's some late arrivals, like they've just basically missed the boat. You know, Storyville, it's kind of in hindsight, they probably didn't realize that. It didn't go away. And Mayor Martin Burm famously said, you can make it prostitution illegal, but you can't make it unpopular.
Yeah.
So it absolutely still existed. It wasn't like they switched off the red light
Yeah.
and it was over.
Well,
That's
even
David
Louis
Vitter.
Armstrong has a saying too. He talks about it and he said, well, they basically went back into neighborhoods, so we ended up nice and reformed. I mean, tongue in cheek. It's like nothing ever
Prostitution
happened.
in New Orleans is why David Vitter didn't become Speaker of the House.
I think it's why
So
David.
it's-
I think David Vitter is why David Vitter
Yeah,
didn't
right.
become Speaker of the House. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Oh goodness. Oh gosh, I'm so glad you asked that question. We're staging opera in New Orleans from 1796 on. By
We're the
the end
opera
of-
capital.
By the end of pardon?
Opera capital. That was one of our
Yeah.
big claims to fame. Yeah.
And you know, by the antebellum period, you've got French, Italian, and American opera companies, all with their own respective orchestras, which go back and forth to the old country. In the off season, there's a newspaper devoted entirely to opera gossip, and this was said to be a place where you could walk down the wharves and hear stevedore whistling an aria. It was a music that was embraced by everyone. It wasn't just the high-minded. And to his dying day, Jelly Roll Morton could sit down and play the Misery from Il Trovatore, because that's what the customers wanted when he first started at the Storyville district.
And he talks about as a kid going to the French Opera House, which was here in the quarter until 1919 when it burns down. And but in the brothels, they're playing opera overtures on the piano. But there's this long history of opera in the city.
More opera houses per capita than any other city in North America.
There's a famous quote.
Bellini, they all debuted operas in
Yeah.
the world here in New Orleans.
Well, the thing is, since we got on our opera kick, a lot of operas premiere here in New Orleans, and then what happens is it's too hot here in the summer, so a lot of the troops are going up to the Eastern Seaboard, places like they're going on tour in places like Philadelphia and New York and Boston, and those places are seeing it second, but claiming to see it first, and we see kind of the loss of this story in New Orleans.
Yeah, before jazz
history.
came along, the music most identified with New Orleans was opera.
There's a great quote, and I know I'm not gonna say it correctly, so if you can remember it. Something, New Orleans had the first opera company in the country and was the last to have public sewage. Some famous quote. So
Yeah, sounds
yeah,
right.
and did you have a question in the back, sir?
Oh, just to add to what he said, we still have Creole opera here.
Yeah.
The opera Creole still plays, and some of their works go back to the mid-1800s. My question, utterly different from the others, was there any were there any sex workers that were not biological women?
Oh,
That's an interesting question.
I can answer that.
Okay.
I don't know about the Storyville district, but fights would often break out at a place called Spanos on Poitras Street. It was in the 1200 block. Kid Ory talks about this in his autobiography. And you would hear a kerfuffle on the side of the bar and some slapping and yelling, and somebody figured out what you just mentioned. Thought he was with a woman, and not so much. So yeah, that was definitely something that was happening. The colloquial phrase then was freakish. So if you come across a song by Jelly Roll Morton or so forth, that was the term that was used to refer to men that way, as being freakish.
There was actually also a movement during World War I where they were hiring female police officers because they were worried that German spies were going to be dressed up as women and that we wouldn't suspect them. And the only way a woman could identify who a really woman was a woman. And so they were saying, we're worried about German spies coming in and they're going to wear their wigs and we won't be able to identify them. But if we hire women, they'll be able to sniff out the real women versus the real men.
I've always found men are much better at sniffing out women.
Okay.
That's just me.
Boom. Okay. Really quick, I just want to mention this. Klaus, do you want to mention this very this
Oh, I
image
thought
up
this
here
was
really quickly.
interesting. Yeah, we're talking
Yeah.
about Josie Arlington a
Yeah.
little bit. It's coming full circle. So she actually retires in 1907. She made enough money. She really wanted to separate herself from sex work. So what she does is she buys this amazing mansion on Esplanade Avenue, built probably around 1860. 1865. She ends up turning the operations over to one of her associates, Anna Casey, and she goes and tries to live a normal life. So she's now living on Esplanade. She ends up dying, ironically, on Valentine's Day, 1914. And what's interesting, we have an original copy of the 1914 Blue Book in 1915. And it's very hard to date the Blue Book, so they didn't put a lot of information you could date them in. In that one, we know for sure because our 1914 Blue Book mentions her by name. The 2015 is exact same ad.
1915.
Yeah, sorry, 1914. The 1915 one basically gets rid of her name and puts Arlington in there because she had died the year earlier. So we know that's at least after that. But the mansion is actually now for sale for $3 million. It just came
So
on
if
the
anyone
market.
wants it,
It's for sale.
Yeah,
it's up for
yeah.
sale. And now it was
Yeah.
moved. It's on Grand Route St. John.
Yeah, they
Well,
moved
no,
it.
it was on Esplanade.
It was
and
on
then
Esplanade. They
they
moved it.
moved it to Grand Route St. John. Yeah. Ironically, she was really close to Sidney Story, to the man who wrote the ordinance. So we do have Klaus bought some Blue Book samples if you want to come up and look. And there's information on the museums, the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Storyville Museum, some of the tours that John does. And if there's no more questions, thank you all. And thank you all for busting these moves. I appreciate it. And thank you for having us.